from the NewsChannel 5 network. This is OpenLine.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to OpenLine. Glad you are with us tonight on this Wednesday night. We are talking about efforts to enact gun control legislation nationally. President Biden just signed some executive orders. He is also pushing Congress to take action on gun control. And then here locally in Tennessee, gun rights have been expanded with permitless carry. We'll talk about that. And this all comes in the wake of some tragic shootings nationwide and certainly here in Tennessee. We have with us John Harris, who helps explain these things. Now, he's very definitely on one side. He's with the Tennessee Firearms Association. But, John, I appreciate you joining us via Zoom.
Thank you tonight.
Yes, well, there you are. I hear you. I don't see you, but there. Good. Thank you for being here. All right. My question is, so President Biden signed some executive actions last week. There were three main ones. Ghost guns, one of them. What were these executive actions that were signed last week?
The three primary executive actions of the six that he signed address ghost guns. The second item that he addressed was pistols with arm braces, which have been around for a while. There's an estimated 40 million of those in the nation at this point. And then the third topic was red flag laws. Those were the three main topics.
Ghost guns, how do you define those? I would define those as homemade or makeshift firearms that lack serial numbers. And he's saying you have to undergo a background check. Is that accurate?
Now, what a ghost gun, it's sort of a bad terminology for it, but under the 1968 Gun Control Act, because Congress is limited to regulating interstate commerce, they had no constitutional authority to tell civilians that they couldn't manufacture their own firearms. So there's a provision in the 68 Act that allows a civilian to manufacture their own firearms. And if those are manufactured by a civilian without the intent for resale, then they don't have to have serial numbers on them. And what he's referring to as a ghost gun is basically that. It's a perfectly legal gun that by law does not have to be serialized, but it cannot be sold either. It can be inherited, it can be passed down, but you can't sell those, and commonly they're not sold.
Could you give it to somebody? Could you give it to your neighbor? Like, I really like you, neighbor, and I'm going to give you this gun that I made?
You can get away with doing that, yes.
And how comfortable are you with that?
Well, I mean, the fact is that whether the gun's got a serial number or not doesn't change whether or not it's used in a crime. And generally, the guns without serial numbers that have been used in crimes have had the serial numbers obliterated one way or the other. Criminals aren't going to take the time to go make a gun for purposes of committing a crime. They're going to steal one, they're going to go buy one, perhaps even buy it legally, but they're not going to go make these things. These are mainly intense hobbyists because it's not a simple process to make a firearm at home these days.
And so let's say you are an intense hobbyist, you obey the law. How does this executive action harm that person in any way?
Well, first, it creates a problem where the federal government would be infringing or exceeding its authority because it has no ability under the Second or the 10th Amendment to regulate intrastate non-commercial activity. And that really ought to be the end of the inquiry. The question is this an area that Congress has the authority to regulate? And it doesn't. And that's where we draw the line, as opposed to saying, how does it harm the individual? It's just an area where they don't even have jurisdiction to act.
Well, now the president must feel like he does have jurisdiction. I mean, obviously, I guess there's some that say he doesn't, but there's some that believe he does if he signed it. So if he feels like he has it, how does it harm a hobbyist who's making his own gun?
Well, it forces that hobbyist, depending on where they end up going with these, what he's directed the ATF to do is prepare regulations. We haven't seen those regulations yet or what they're going to do. But he has violated so many constitutional principles in doing it. And to answer your question, we don't know because we haven't seen the regs. We don't know if they're going to require individuals to become licensed by the ATF, if they're going to have to go to some portal or some location and serialize the weapons and then register them with the federal government. There's just a host of reasons why it's going to hurt the individuals if this comes through. And the other thing that it does, Trump supported an act sort of like this a couple of years ago where he directed ATF to somehow regulate bump stocks. Well, the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the federal district appellate level courts that cover Tennessee, Kentucky, Ohio, and Michigan, has just ruled within the last 30 days that the executive branch, the president and the ATF, have no authority under the Constitution because of the concept of separation of powers to change the definitions of statutes that Congress has created, nor to create new laws. And what Biden's trying to do would violate that constitutional separation of powers, just like Trump did when he directed ATF to reclassify bump stocks.
So as we're coming out of COVID, we have seen some disturbing mass shootings. We've seen them nationally. We've seen some disturbing shootings here in Tennessee, in Nashville and Knoxville. There have been some disturbing things. I don't know that we're going to solve these problems tonight, but let me ask you, okay, so in the wake of what we've seen here, is there any sort of a gun control measure that makes sense to you, or is there nothing that makes sense to you?
Well, I've been doing this for a quarter century now, and we have seen over and over and over again all kinds of proposed gun control measures, like the '94 assault weapons ban that ran for 10 years and was a proven failure because it didn't stop anything other than lawful commerce. The measures of the category that Biden's proposing are not going to stop, reduce, or eliminate crime. It's just not going to happen. What he's going to have to do, and it's really a burden on the states more so than even the federal government, because the federal government doesn't even have authority constitutionally to deal with this, is the states are going to need to start dealing with mental health issues, getting treatment and getting treatment programs that will deal with and catch mental health problems that these mass shooters clearly have before they become, aggressive murderers. They're going to have to deal with letting violent criminals out of jail too soon and without proven rehabilitation, and deal with the problems of violence in society as opposed to dealing with the issues related to the choice of weapons, because the weapon issue battle is a political battle. It's not one that's going to solve the problem.
Yes. Now you talk about states. So in Tennessee, we've enacted, we're one of 19 states where permitless carry went into effect. And I'm quoting here from the Tennessean: the bill allows most adults to carry a handgun without a permit. Now, Jim Cooper, our congressman, he said, Tennessee gun laws are now some of the loosest in the nation. We are less safe. How many more gun deaths must we suffer before we curb gun violence? He said that a day ago. So that's Cooper. That's Jim Cooper. What do you think when you hear that in response to this permitless carry?
He didn't have the first clue about what he's talking about. If you look at, when I started doing this a quarter century ago, one state had what we call constitutional carry or permitless carry, and that was Vermont. Today, at least 20 states have this kind of law, and as many as 23. There's a few states that have it in part of the state, but not all of the state. 30 states have, and have had for a long time, no permit at all to carry the weapon openly. They had a concealed weapons requirement, but not for open carry. And what you have seen over the last quarter century as the states have adopted this permitless carry or constitutional carry system is that not a single state has seen an increase in violent crime that is connected to allowing citizens to carry firearms. People like Cooper assert that a fact is out there just because he wants it to be, but he can't point to a single state where that has actually happened. In fact, what you tend to see is as people get used to the idea of carrying a weapon, even without a permit, if there are available permits that give them increased flexibility, like interstate reciprocity, they tend to go get additional training and actually end up signing up for the permits. So you see in many states an increase in permit sales that go along with this. The other thing that you'll notice from looking at the states that have adopted this over the last quarter century is none of them, not a single one, have gone back and curtailed or restricted that law once they put it on the books. They have instead typically moved forward with increasing the ability of citizens to carry and increasing the places in which citizens can carry legally.
You earlier said the assault ban was a complete failure. That was signed in 1994. You said it went on for 10 years, so I guess it ended in 2004?
Yes, it had a sunset clause in it. It had to be renewed at the end of 10 years or it expired.
And so from 2004 to now, we have not had that, right?
Correct.
I mean, when you look at the number of mass shootings, couldn't you argue it's been a complete failure not to have it? I mean, we just see so many of these things, and I think that's where somebody like Cooper is saying we're less safe because we keep seeing shootings, mass shootings, that kind of thing, and we just keep opening up the number of guns, increasing the number of guns that people have access to. Is there some correlation there?
No, none at all, because what we have experienced is increased reporting and focus by the news media and the left, but there's no data, and there was no data generated during that 10-year period that having the assault weapons ban did anything at all. I mean, the data is indisputable that it was a failure in terms of having a goal of reduction of crime. And in fact, if you look at real data as opposed to what Jim Cooper wants to look at, you look at, for example, 2019's data from the FBI on crime statistics, and believe me, as an attorney, there's plenty of statistics that the government keeps on firearms and firearms-related crime. In 2019, of the over 10,000 homicides in the nation involving firearms, less than 500 of those involved long arms, rifles or shotguns. And of the 500, some of those involved things that aren't assault weapons, just regular rifles or shotguns. You literally had more people in 2019 die from knife wounds than you did have deaths from rifles or shotguns.
How do you explain the school shootings that we see that just horrify people? Some of these mass shootings that we see, there was that one in Colorado where 10 people were killed just a couple of weeks ago. I mean, there's so many now. I don't think that's the result of just the media over covering those things. Maybe that's what you think. I don't know. But how do you explain why that is happening right now?
Well, I don't blame it on the proliferation of guns. I mean, we've got more guns in this nation than we've ever had. What we have also had during this same window of time is an increasing situation with placing kids on drugs earlier and earlier to control their ADHD or whatever it is they're trying to control. So we're medicating the kids earlier in ways that are likely potentially dangerous in terms of long-term effects. We're not teaching proper respect to students and children in the school system, much less in society. And we've sort of sensationalized firearms with a lot of these video games and whatnot that are out there, to the point that these kids have psychological or emotional problems, and they're resorting to, sometimes, like perhaps the child in Knoxville, this outburst that was just uncontrolled. And the only thing that's going to stop that on school grounds and in other locations is not doing away with access to the firearms, because you effectively can't unless you just ban all of them. And that's never going to stand. Is having, like the Knoxville situation did, having trained adults, teachers, SROs, even parents who are armed and are capable to be armed to intercede before it becomes a multi-victim shooting. And that's the one thing that we did learn from the Knoxville situation, is someone there with a gun like the church shooting in Texas last year, where the guy was shot the minute the weapon was pulled. Someone legally carrying, prepared to carry, and ready to act when the threat presents itself is much more effective than all this silliness that Cooper and Biden want to present.
How concerned are you? You obviously, love guns. You are a big supporter of the Second Amendment. How concerned are you that more and more mass shootings will eventually lead to gun control? I mean, every time it seems to be batted down, but at some point, as we see more and more of these things, do you think there will be some kind of gun control? And if you're concerned about that, does that mean that you should work maybe even harder to combat some of the things you mentioned, you identified as problems in your last answer? But how concerned are you that as we see more of these things, there will eventually be some kind of gun control?
Well, what we do know, because we've got 50 states and 50 different sets of laws, and in the jurisdiction within the states we have different laws. And what we know is as gun control as a policy proliferates, like in Chicago and New York, violent crime goes up. Good people become victims. And what I think will happen if the left keeps pushing on these gun control issues is you're going to see a revolt. And the revolt's likely going to come from even Democrats who are fed up with it, transferring over to support the conservatives, maybe not changing parties, but voting for people like Trump when the opportunity presents. And I think you're going to see that increasingly.
I mean, it's interesting you would say people get fed up, because and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't see that there's been a lot of gun control legislation enacted. So I don't see why, if you were for gun rights, you would be fed up. At this point, what you have is over and over again, we see a shooting, there are calls for gun control, and over again, those calls kind of go nowhere. It seems like if anybody's going to get fed up, it's going to be the other side.
I've been, like I said, I've been doing it for a quarter century, and every year in and year out, some event happens. It's the shooting in Knoxville, it's Sandy Hook, it's Florida, it's the movie theaters. They happen, and until we figure out how to eliminate crime and eliminate violence and solve mental health, they're going to continue to happen. And you can't get rid of the guns. And conservatives, Second Amendment supporters, look at places like New York City, California, Washington, D.C., the riots going on in Portland, Oregon, and they go, we don't want anything to do with that. And that's why you see in the last 2 years, you can't hardly find a gun in a store to buy, because the volume of sales in Tennessee are outstripping anything we've seen since we started tracking sales statewide in 1998. People are rushing to buy these things. You can't find guns, you can't find ammo, and that's not because they're suddenly popular or scarce in manufacture. It's because the demand for private ownership of firearms is escalating, and I think it's going to escalate far more with Biden and Harris in control.
That's true. Gun sales are up. There's no doubt about it.
No doubt about it.
The Tennessee Firearms Association has supported several of the bills that are out there in the legislature in Tennessee that loosen gun restrictions. Is your organization, is it supporting any of those other things you talk about when it comes to mental health? And are you pushing those things as aggressively as you're pushing loosening some of these gun restrictions?
Oh, absolutely. Let me give you two examples. This year, there was a bill filed this year, I think Representative Ogles had it, that would have required age-appropriate firearms training in public schools and charter schools. I don't think the bill is going to pass this year, but that's a bill we flagged and that we supported, because we do think that it is appropriate and incumbent upon our education system not to be putting guns in a closet, but to teach people why the Second Amendment exists, what its purposes are, what is a safe way to handle a gun that's age appropriate. And we would love to see them expand opportunities in schools, like some schools already have, for scholastic shooting programs that in Tennessee are supported by TWRA. The other
now,
bill.
What if you're a parent and you don't want that? You're not comfortable with your child being around guns. Is that for everybody? Is that what that bill would do? All kids would just learn how to shoot a gun?
Well, I mean, we teach sex education, but we don't make them, engage necessarily as part of course curriculum. Okay? So our position is they need to be taught in a classroom environment. Bring in law enforcement if you want to, but teach appropriate firearms awareness, but then have, just like you do soccer and softball and baseball and football, have scholastic opportunities where kids can shoot competitively in the state. And some schools are already doing that. We need to expand that program. The other bill that we supported, or that we tried to support, was an amendment to the governor's bill. There's a huge problem that we were concerned about with the governor's bill, because under federal law, if you have a mental health restriction, what's called a 922 G4 restriction, you can't own a firearm. You can't buy a firearm, you can't own it, you can't possess it. Well, in 2007, the federal government passed a law that said to states, if you will start adopting and implementing mental health programs that will provide federal funding for that. And as a condition to providing the federal funding, the state had to pass, and Tennessee passed these laws in 2015, what's called relief of disabilities statutes. And what that means is someone that's had a mental health committal or a conservatorship or even an insanity plea could, under certain circumstances, with affidavits from medical professionals, go in front of a judge and have that disability removed by court order. And so we get federal funding for having that program. The governor's bill that just passed makes mental health a lifetime ban if you fall into certain categories. It did not have the language that we wanted on it that said, unless you have successfully completed a relief of disabilities program, because we were concerned about not only that, but we were also concerned about maintaining the federal funding for mental health treatment programs.
So, all right, so when I ask about, are there some bills you're pushing, I was thinking something about video games or more help for mental health issues that maybe at the core of some of these gun and mass shootings. But you're saying what you supported was complete education for children in our schools about guns, and then people who were mentally ill and weren't allowed to get a gun, they should have the right to get their gun back.
We want to comply with the federal program, relief of disabilities program, to maintain access to the federal funds that are connected with it.
Is there any other?
If a psychiatrist comes in and says, this person's recovered, they're no longer a problem, they're no longer a threat, if the doctors will swear on that to the court, and the court, after hearing from the state, because the district attorney gets to oppose it, makes a finding that the person is recovered, I'm okay if they've got their rights back. Some people may think that a mental health problem is a lifelong problem, but I think people, not all of them, but some people who have mental health, an acute crisis, for example, because of a spouse or a child dying, can get over it. And if the doctor says they have, then I'm good with that.
And so when will the powerful gun lobby put its power behind something like a mental health reform or some sort of mental health bill, or something along the lines of doing something about video games? I guess that's my question.
Okay.
Is there anything like that?
Not in particular. It's a big enough fight for us to just track the 50 to 70 bills a year that we track without having to go out and become an advocate on collateral issues. Now, if those bills are filed by other interest groups, we would look at them and decide to support them or not support them, depending on what they did. But we're more interested in passing real constitutional carry, which we still have to do because the governor's bill didn't even do that.
And then we'll go to commercial. But don't you see these mass shootings as a threat to what it is you're fighting for? Every time there's a mass shooting, there is a call for more gun control. And if you think that guns are not the reason for these mass shootings, guns have nothing to do with it, it's all these other issues, would it not be in your interest to fight for reforms on some of these other issues, to be a powerful voice in those areas?
We would support efforts in those areas, but we're not going to take the lead on it because we've got other more focused core issues that we're working on.
Okay. All right. We have a few calls, so we'll take a break here. If you want to call in, there's the number 615-737-plus 615-737-7587. We will take a break. Be back right after this.